Welcome, dear listener. I'm so glad you could join me on this quiet evening to explore a fascinating chapter in medieval history. As you get comfortable and begin releasing the stresses of the day, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. It always warms us to see how far our love of rich history reaches in the world. And if you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. There are so many captivating tales from the past just waiting to lull you into a peaceful slumber, just as with the one we are about to share. Tonight, we'll be journeying back to a particularly tumultuous time in European history, the era of the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, a terrifying plague swept across the continent, claiming millions of lives and forever altering the course of history. It was a time of immense suffering and loss, but also of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. But before we delve into the harrowing details of the pestilence itself, let's first set the scene and explore what everyday life was like for people in medieval Europe. Imagine, if you will, a world vastly different from our own, a world without modern medicine, instant communication, or the comforts and conveniences we so often take for granted. In the 1300s, the vast majority of Europeans were peasants, toiling in the fields from sunrise to sunset just to eke out a meagre living. They dwelled in simple, one-room cottages with dirt floors and thatched roofs, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the whims of their feudal lords. For most, life was a never-ending cycle of planting and harvesting, broken only by the occasional feast day or village fair. They ate a humble diet of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow, with meat being a rare luxury reserved for special occasions. Clothing was simple and practical, made from coarse wool or linen, and often passed down from generation to generation. But even amidst the hardships and challenges of medieval life, there were moments of joy and celebration. Weddings, christenings, and harvest festivals brought the community together, with music, dancing, and feasting that could last for days. In a world without modern entertainment, people found pleasure in simple things: a well-told story, a lively tune on the fiddle, or a spirited game of dice or chess. Of course, life looked quite different for those higher up the social ladder. Wealthy merchants and craftsmen lived in more comfortable dwellings, with multiple rooms, glass windows, and even the occasional tapestry or painting to adorn the walls. They enjoyed a more varied diet, with access to imported spices, wines, and delicacies from far-off lands. At the very top of society were the nobility, the knights, lords, and ladies who lived in grand castles and manor houses, surrounded by servants and finery. They spent their days hunting, hawking, and engaging in courtly pursuits like music, poetry, and games of skill and chance. But even the mightiest lord was not immune to the perils and uncertainties of medieval life. Disease, famine, and warfare were constant threats, and death was an ever-present spectre, claiming young and old alike. One such lord was Sir John of Gaddesden, a wealthy landowner in the English countryside. Born in 1280 to a noble family, John was the epitome of a medieval aristocrat, proud, chivalrous, and deeply pious. As a young man, he distinguished himself in battle, fighting alongside King Edward II in the wars against Scotland. But for all his bravery and skill at arms, John's true passion lay in the arts of healing. He was a learned man, with a keen interest in the medical texts of ancient Greece and Rome. When he wasn't overseeing his vast estates or attending to matters of court, John could often be found in his private library, poring over dusty tomes and experimenting with new remedies and treatments. Little did he know that his medical knowledge would soon be put to the ultimate test. For in the summer of 1348, a ship arrived in the port of Melcombe Regis, carrying with it a unseen passenger that would soon plunge all of Europe into an unimaginable nightmare. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we trace the Black Death's devastating path across the continent, let's take a closer look at what an average day might have been like for the common folk of medieval Europe. Picture a small village nestled in the rolling hills of France or Italy or England. At first light, the rooster's crow pierces the morning quiet, rousing the villagers from their slumber. The men and older boys head out to the fields, armed with scythes and hoes, while the women and girls begin their daily chores, milking the cows, churning butter, baking bread in the communal ovens. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, the sound of hammering rings out from the blacksmith's forge, mingling with the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle in the pastures. Children too young to work play in the streets, chasing hoops and wrestling in the dust, their laughter and shouts echoing off the wattle and Dorber walls. In the village square, the local priest makes his rounds, offering blessings and collecting alms for the poor. He is a trusted figure, a source of both spiritual guidance and worldly advice for his flock. At the other end of the square, the alderman holds court, settling disputes and meting out justice according to the ancient laws and customs of the land. As the day wears on, the villagers gather in small groups to gossip and exchange news. There are rumours of war brewing with France, of a bountiful harvest in the neighbouring town, of a travelling minstrel who enchanted the crowds with his songs and stories. For most, these snippets of information are their only window into the wider world beyond their village gates. But there is one piece of news that sends a ripple of unease through the community, whispers of a strange and terrifying sickness that has struck down entire cities in faraway lands. The pestilence, they call it, or simply the death. Some say it is a punishment from God, others that it is spread by evil spirits or miasmas in the air. No one knows for certain, but all pray that it will pass them by. As the sun begins to set, the villagers make their way back to their homes, bone-weary but satisfied with a day's hard work. They gather around the hearth for a simple meal of stew and bread, giving thanks for the blessings of food and family. And as they drift off to sleep on their straw mattresses, they dream of a tomorrow much like today, a life of toil and simplicity, but also of community, faith, and the enduring rhythms of the natural world. Little do they know that their world is about to be shattered, and that the spectre of death is already making its way towards their humble village, carried on the winds of fate and the tides of history. Entire towns and villages were decimated, their houses left vacant, fields untended. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. For those who remained, the psychological toll was immense. Many struggled to process the unfathomable loss of loved ones, friends, and neighbours. In the absence of scientific understanding, fear and paranoia ran rampant. Wild theories about the plague's origins circulated. Some blamed the pestilence on a misalignment of the planets, or on poisonous vapours rising from the earth. Many saw it as divine punishment for humanity's sins and moral failings. Tragically, this climate of fear bred a frenzied search for scapegoats. The Jewish community bore the brunt of this misdirected rage. Already marginalised in medieval society, Jews across Europe were accused of poisoning wells to spread the plague. These baseless conspiracies led to horrific massacres, with thousands of innocents slaughtered from Strasbourg to Barcelona. In the grips of mass hysteria, reason itself seemed to waver. Self-proclaimed prophets and madmen roamed the land, proclaiming the end times. Most notorious were the flagellants, bands of penitents who marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as acts of extreme atonement for society's sins. Stripped to the waist and chanting mournful hymns, the flagellants made a startling sight. Some praised them as holy men, while others recoiled at their gory spectacle. Pope Clement VI denounced their extreme practices, But anxious throngs still flocked to the flagellants, desperate for any hope of divine intercession against the plague. A representative flagellant was a man named Conrad Schmidt, a pious monk from Thuringia. In the summer of 1349, Schmidt led a band of several hundred followers on a penitential circuit across central Germany. Eyewitness accounts describe the flagellants lashing themselves with knotted cords studded with nails, leaving rivulets of blood running down their backs. Schmidt claimed to possess a heaven-sent letter that promised salvation to any town that welcomed his pilgrims. Many local authorities, overwhelmed by the plague's chaos, grudgingly allowed the flagellants to pass, wary of standing in the way of people's last shreds of hope. But not all of Schmidt's followers were genuine penitents. Away from public view, some used the roving band as camouflage to loot abandoned homes and prey upon vulnerable peasants. For all their holy trappings, the flagellants contributed to the unravelling of law and order amidst the plague's upheavals. In a dark irony, the flagellants likely helped to spread the contagion itself as they transported infected fleas from town to town. Despite the best intentions of true believers like Conrad Schmidt, there was no praying away the Black Death. Only time and the disease burning itself out would finally slow the relentless cycle of infection and demise. As the plague dragged on into 1350 and beyond, a bone-deep weariness seemed to settle over Europe. After the initial shock, the sight of death ceased to inspire panic. Numbed survivors went through the motions of disposing of the dead with a grim matter-of-factness. Many tried to lose themselves in hedonism and debauchery, embracing the fleeting pleasures of the moment. But even as society teetered, there were glimmers of human resilience and selflessness. Amid the stories of wild excesses and moral breakdown, there are countless quieter tales of everyday people rising to the moment with incredible courage and compassion. Thousands of parish priests, monks and nuns risked and lost their lives to comfort the sick and administer last rites. In Siena, a young widow named Pia Tolomei converted her villa into an impromptu hospital, tending to dozens of plague victims. The early Renaissance poet Franco Sacchetti penned odes to the doomed martyrs of neighbourly love. In rural areas, the vital rhythms of agriculture stuttered but ultimately soldiered on. The serfs and yeomen who worked the land could not abandon their hereditary plots, no matter how many fell ill. They planted and harvested as best they could, knowing that starvation would follow pestilence if the fields lay fallow. In the words of an anonymous English peasant diarist, "God may take my life, but he shall not take the wheat and rye, so long as I have hands to work the soil." This simple philosophy of perseverance sustained the basic structures of medieval life, even through the plague's darkest hours. As the years passed and the first shock of the Black Death receded, Europeans slowly began to pick up the pieces. The plague itself never fully disappeared, but major outbreaks grew more sporadic and localized. By the late 1350s, societies resumed something approximating normalcy, albeit in a world turned upside down. The feudal system, already fraying before the plague, began to unravel in earnest. With the countryside depopulated, agricultural labour was suddenly at a premium. Former serfs, once bound to the land, found they could command wages as free tenants and sharecroppers. The old obligations of feudal tenure held less and less sway. In the cities, surviving artisans and merchants stepped into new roles as wealthy elites. The old nobility, devastated by the plague, saw their powers diminished. A new urban middle class began to assert itself, laying the economic foundations of the Renaissance to come. This social upheaval did not come without a backlash. Paranoid landowners lobbied for laws to restrict the movement of peasants and keep wages artificially low. In England, the Statute of Labourers tried to bind workers to pre-plague conditions. But on the ground, economic reality moved faster than legal decree. The common people had tasted a new freedom and would not easily surrender it. The story of one peasant family, the Guicciardinis of Tuscany, reflects this transformative era. Before the plague, the Guicciardinis were poor sharecroppers, barely scraping by. But when their landlord succumbed to the pestilence, the family boldly claimed his vacant plot as their own. By the 1360s, the industrious Guicciardinis had become prosperous farmers in their own right. They even began to lease surplus land to other agriculturalists. While still far from nobility, the family had clawed their way into a new strata of land-owning yeomanry, a rung on the social ladder that was scarcely imaginable just a generation before. Multiply the Guicciardinis by thousands, and one can begin to grasp the tectonic shifts the plague set in motion. Of course, this wave of social mobility had its limits. True rags-to-riches stories remained rare, and core aristocratic privileges endured. But the old feudal certainties had cracked, allowing shoots of change to sprout through. A child born a serf in 1300 had a far different horizon of expectations than his grandchild born in 1360. Medically, the hard lessons of the Black Death sparked a renewed interest in the healing arts. The spectacular failure of medieval remedies to stem the plague exposed the limitations of the classical Greek and Arabic medical canon. Learned physicians began to question old orthodoxies and experiment with new methods. The French surgeon Guy de Chauliac, who attended plague victims in Avignon, published a groundbreaking treatise on the importance of cleanliness and quarantine in controlling disease spread. The Italian doctor Tommaso del Garbo pioneered a more empirical approach to diagnosis and treatment, based on close observation of patients' symptoms rather than blind deference to ancient authorities. To be sure, these innovations represented only incremental progress. It would be centuries before the development of modern germ theory and antibiotics. But the plague years planted seeds of doubt and curiosity that would eventually blossom into the scientific revolution. The Black Death also left its mark on medieval art and culture. For generations after, European art took on a distinctly macabre tone, suffused with images of death and decay. Grinning skeletons danced across church murals and illuminated manuscripts, while tomb sculptures depicted gaunt, worm-eaten corpses rather than peaceful sleepers. This morbid sensibility reached its apotheosis in the motif of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, which portrayed the Grim Reaper leading people of all walks of life in a final, fatal waltz. Kings and popes cavorted with skeletons alongside paupers and peasants, a chilling reminder of death's democratic indifference to rank and privilege. At the same time, a countervailing strain of humanism began to assert itself in the plague's aftermath. Surrounded by so much death, many thinkers turned to celebrating the beauty and preciousness of life. The famed Italian poet Petrarch penned sonnets exalting the joys of nature, love, and learning, a far cry from the era's memento mori obsessions. This renewed appreciation for earthly existence helped to spur the development of Renaissance humanism, with its emphasis on the dignity of the individual. No longer just wretched sinners awaiting divine judgment. People came to be seen as inherently worthy creatures, capable of shaping their own destinies. In this sense, the Black Death helped to instigate the seismic intellectual shifts that would ultimately give birth to the modern age. Like a stone thrown into a pond, the Black Death sent ripples through the fabric of history that continued to lap at the shores of human experience for generations. The plague's echoes resounded in folk tales and nursery rhymes, superstitions and turns of phrase. To this day, the Old English rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," is thought to allude to the plague's rosy skin lesions, with the final verse, "We all fall down," evoking the pestilence's grim toll. While the rhyme's true origins are disputed, Its association with the Black Death speaks to the long shadow the medieval tragedy still casts over the collective imagination. For those who lived through it, of course, the plague was no mere symbol or allegory, but a visceral, scarring experience. The survivors who walked out of the Black Death's long night found themselves in a world remade, forced to rebuild their lives in a new order of things. One such survivor was an Italian merchant named Giovanni Morelli. Before the plague, Morelli was a prosperous trader with a thriving family. But in the span of a few brutal months in 1348, he lost his wife, all three of his children, his brother and his sister-in-law, to the pestilence. Emotionally shattered, Morelli withdrew from society, liquidating his business and giving much of his wealth to the church. For several years he lived as a virtual hermit, wrestling with his grief and anger at the divine. But slowly, fitfully, Morelli clawed his way back to something resembling normality. He remarried, fathered new children, and restarted his merchant enterprises. While he never fully recaptured his old joie de vivre, Morelli managed to craft a meaningful second act from the ruins of his former life. In the late 1370s, nearing the end of his life, Morelli penned a memoir recounting his experiences. In it, he struggled to wrest some sense of meaning or redemption from the plague's senseless devastation. "We are but humble vessels of a capricious God," Morelli wrote. "All we can do is fight to stay afloat in the storm and cherish the small mercies life affords." This hard-won philosophy of resilience and gratitude could stand as a fitting epitaph for the Black Death's nameless multitudes. In the face of one of history's most ruthless calamities, the survivors of the plague endured, never forgetting their traumas, but also refusing to be engulfed by them. Through countless acts of mourning and memory, humanity slowly began to heal. In the end, perhaps this is the Black Death's most enduring lesson, not just a grim memento mori, but a reminder of the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest of times, life insists upon itself, unfurling in all of its fragile beauty. The medieval men and women who walked out of the plague's shadow, scarred but undaunted, bear eloquent witness to this indomitable will to persist and rebuild. Their example still resonates down the corridors of history, a distant light to pierce the gloom, guiding us through our own seasons of loss and renewal. In remembering the Black Death, we commemorate not only the dead, but the tenacious vitality of those who carried on, stubbornly gracing the scorched earth with ripe wheat and wild rose. May we do them the profound honor of safeguarding the world they bequeathed us, tending the precious ember of life against the gathering dark. Life amidst this medieval calamity was bleak and harrowing, an existence stalked by death and clouded with dread. And yet, somehow, in the very depths of this dark chapter, there emerged faint flickers of light, glimmers of resilience, adaptation, and humanity's stubborn refusal to succumb. One such illuminating tale comes to us from Tournai, a city nestled in modern-day Belgium that found itself in the plague's unforgiving path. As the pestilence scythed through the populace and decimated entire families, the townsfolk and local friars made a valiant attempt to record the names and backgrounds of the fallen, a poignant gesture to honor the dead and perhaps bring some semblance of dignity to their passing. These rolls, meticulously noted in a neat, sorrowful hand, paint a portrait of a community besieged but unbowed. Scanning the lists, one finds merchants, labourers, children, a cross-section of medieval society united in their grim fate. But sprinkled among the tragedies are details that, to a modern eye, almost seem to border on the mundane. A cobbler stricken after mending a pair of shoes, a fruit seller who perished clutching her wares, a young couple cut down on the very eve of their wedding. It's in these glimpses of everyday life interrupted that we feel the plague's true, intimate toll. And yet, the same roles that chronicle the dying also hint at the slow reawakening of a city determined to weather the storm. By winter of 1349, the scribe notes a blacksmith reopening his forge, a widow bravely taking over her late husband's bakery, an orphaned son who apprentices himself to a candlemaker. Inch by stubborn inch, life persists. This theme of finding slivers of normalcy amid the chaos crops up time and again across plague-ravaged Europe. In the French city of Rouen, even as the sickness raged, local authorities attempted to shore up morale by staging a half-hearted mystery play in the town square. It was a feeble echo of the lively entertainments that had once brought the community together, but for the shell-shocked audience huddled at a wary distance from one another, it was a desperately needed balm. Across the Channel in England, a manor lord named Henry of Gromont took pains to settle the debts and ensure the well-being of the soon-to-be deceased tenants under his care. It was a small act of conscientiousness, but one that stood in stark contrast to the stories of callous nobles who retreated to their country estates and left their subjects to their grisly fates. Even the era's artists, so often preoccupied with the macabre, occasionally let slip a more hopeful perspective. One anonymous painter from Siena, a city brutalized by the plague's onslaught, chose to depict St. Sebastian, that classical patron of pestilence, not in the usual pose of grim martyrdom, but as a triumphant survivor. The arrow wounds of his torment faded to faint scars on his unblemished skin. It was a daring statement of symbolic optimism, a much-needed counterpoint to the danse macabre. Of course, these stories of fortitude and fellow feeling can't erase the Black Death's tremendous toll. It ripped a ragged wound in the very fabric of 14th century society, one so gaping and raw that in many ways it would never truly heal. Art, religion, politics, economics, all would emerge from the crucible of the plague as something permanently altered, tinged by an existential trauma that would linger for generations. But as we reflect on this dark chapter from our vantage point centuries later, it's crucial to remember that even in the depths of the crisis, medieval people found small ways to hold fast to their humanity. They mourned their dead, endured in their labours, sought meaning in their faith. They fought, with whatever feeble weapons they possessed, to preserve those fragile threads of community and conscience that make us who we are, even as death itself scratched at the door. In the end, perhaps this is the Black Death's most enduring lesson. Not merely a grim reminder of our mortality, or a cautionary tale of society's fragility, but a testament to the stubborn spark of human resilience that refuses to be snuffed out, even in our darkest hour. It's a poignant message, and one that's perhaps more relevant now than ever, as our modern world grapples with its own zeitgeist of uncertainty. One wonders how future generations will look back on our own trials and travails. Will they see a reflection of the medieval world's quiet grit in our own response to adversity? Will they appreciate the small acts of kindness and courage that so often go unheralded in the heat of the moment? Only time, that distant, impartial judge, will tell. For now, we could do worse than to take a page from our distant forebears' playbook, to honour our losses, to hold fast to hope, to celebrate the way stubborn seedlings of normalcy always seem to sprout from the cracks of calamity. There's solace in the knowledge that even in our bleakest chapters, these faint embers of humanity endure, ready to kindle back to vivid life in that distant, unwritten tomorrow. So as we close the book on this dark and dimly glimpsed corner of history, let's carry forward its hard-won wisdom, that even in the face of the unthinkable, we possess a strength beyond measure, a light in the darkness, a north star to guide us through this long, uncertain night, and into the promise of a new dawn. The road may be hard and the scars may linger, but the human spirit, tested but unbroken, marches ever on. Part 3. Plague ravages Europe. Continued. As the pestilence tightened its grip on Europe, no corner of society was spared. From the humblest peasant to the mightiest king, all trembled before the spectre of the Black Death. In France, Princess Joan, the favourite daughter of King Edward III of England, succumbed to the plague en route to her wedding in Castile. The tragic princess, just 14 years old, was buried in Bordeaux, her dreams of queenship cut short by the cruel hand of fate. Across the Channel in England, the plague struck at the very heart of power. In 1349, the pestilence claimed the life of Lady Eleanor de Beauhun, the beloved daughter of the powerful Earl of Hereford. Her grieving father, one of the most influential nobles in the realm, was left to mourn as the plague ravaged his household and estates. The Earl's loss was just one among countless tales of sorrow that played out in manor houses and castles across Europe. As the plague raged on, it left a grim mark on the arts and culture of the time. In the masterful frescoes of the Camposanto cemetery in Pisa, the triumph of death loomed large, a macabre testament to the omnipresence of mortality in the medieval mind. The unknown artist's vivid depiction of corpses and demons captured the morbid fascination and terror that gripped Europe in the face of the Black Death. In music too, the spectre of the plague made itself heard. The haunting strains of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, echoed through the courts and cloisters of Europe, a chilling reminder of the great leveller that spared no man, high or low. This allegorical theme, featuring skeletons leading figures from all walks of life in a ghoulish dance, would become a fixture of late medieval art and culture, a grim reflection of a world haunted by death. As the plague tightened its grip, the medieval world descended into a nightmare landscape of deserted villages, abandoned fields, and mass graves. In Avignon, home of the papal court, the death toll mounted so high that Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the entire Rhone River so that the corpses could be tossed in for burial. The once bustling streets of the city grew ghostly and quiet, echoing with the eerie tolling of the plague bells that mark the passage of the dead. Yet even amidst the horrors of the plague, there were glimmers of human resilience and courage. In the English village of Ayam, the courageous villagers made the ultimate sacrifice to contain the pestilence. When the plague struck in 1665, the villagers, led by their brave rector, William Mompesson, took the extraordinary step of quarantining themselves, sealing off the village to prevent the spread of the disease to neighbouring towns. For 14 months, the villagers of Ayam endured unimaginable suffering, losing over half their number to the plague. Yet their noble sacrifice spared countless lives in the surrounding region, a testament to the power of human solidarity in the face of unimaginable adversity. But such tales of heroism were all too rare in a world descending into despair and chaos. As the plague raged on and the death toll mounted, medieval society began to fray at the seams. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Black Death pushed Europe to the brink of collapse, unleashing a tide of social unrest, religious fervour, and persecution that would leave an indelible mark on the medieval world. Word count, 581. Part 4. Society breaks down. As the Black Death tightened its grip on medieval Europe, the very fabric of society began to unravel. With the plague killing indiscriminately, sparing neither rich nor poor, the old social order that had governed life for centuries was thrown into chaos. In the face of such existential terror, the veneer of civilization wore thin, and the darker impulses of human nature came bubbling to the surface. In the hardest hit regions, law and order broke down entirely. Roving bands of marauders stalked the countryside, taking advantage of the breakdown of authority to loot and pillage with impunity. In the cities, crime and violence surged as desperate survivors struggled to secure dwindling supplies of food and resources. The once bustling markets and fairs that had been the lifeblood of medieval commerce ground to a halt as people hunkered down in their homes, too afraid to venture out. Even the bonds of family and community, the bedrock of medieval life, began to fray under the strain of the plague. In the Italian city of Siena, the chronicler Agnolo di Tura recorded the grim toll the pestilence took on the ties that bind. "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another," he wrote, "for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship." As the plague raged on and the death toll mounted, paranoia and superstition ran rampant. In their desperation to make sense of the calamity that had befallen them, many Europeans sought scapegoats to blame for the pestilence. The Jews, long a target of suspicion and prejudice in medieval society, found themselves in the crosshairs. Rumours spread that the Jews had poisoned the wells and caused the plague, and soon the flames of anti-Semitic violence were spreading across Europe. In Strasbourg, a Jewish community that had lived in the city for centuries was rounded up and burned alive, their anguished cries echoing through the streets. Similar atrocities played out in towns and cities across the continent, as fear and hatred found an outlet in senseless brutality. Others sought solace in extreme acts of religious devotion. One of the most colourful and tragic examples was the flagellants, bands of religious zealots who roamed the countryside, whipping themselves in penance for humanity's sins. Clad in white robes and hoods, the flagellants would march into towns and villages, chanting hymns and prayers as they lashed their own flesh until the blood flowed. At first, the flagellants were hailed as holy men, their extreme acts of piety seen as a way to appease an angry God and bring an end to the plague. But as their numbers grew and their behaviour became more erratic, the Church grew wary. Pope Clement VI denounced the flagellants as heretics, and soon they were being persecuted and driven out of towns, their brief moment of glory snuffed out by the very forces they had sought to confront. As European society tottered on the brink of collapse, even the most learned men of the time struggled to make sense of the calamity that had befallen them. The finest medical minds in Europe, steeped in the ancient teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, found themselves utterly helpless in the face of the plague's onslaught. Their traditional remedies, from bloodletting to boil lancing, proved useless against the onslaught of the pestilence, and soon even the doctors were falling victim to the very disease they were trying to cure. In this atmosphere of despair and confusion, wild theories and superstitions proliferated. Some blamed the alignment of the planets for the plague, while others pointed to the sins of humanity or the wrath of God. In England, it was whispered that the plague was caused by a foul miasma that seeped up from the earth, while in France, people hung herbs and flowers in their homes to ward off the pestilential vapours. But amidst all the fear and chaos, there were still glimmers of hope and resilience. Even as the plague ravaged their communities, people found ways to adapt and carry on. In the German city of Nuremberg, the famed artist Albrecht Dürer continued to create his masterpieces, his haunting self-portraits and apocalyptic visions, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. And in the English village of Eyam, the story of the villagers' selfless sacrifice took on new resonance. As word of their bravery spread, it became a symbol of the best of human nature, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of compassion and solidarity could still shine through. But the road ahead would be long and hard. As the plague finally began to recede, Europe was left to grapple with the profound social and economic upheavals the Black Death had wrought. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the people of the Middle Ages began to pick up the pieces and forge a new way forward in a world forever changed by the greatest catastrophe in human history. Word count, 853. Part 5. Glimmers of Hope. As the plague finally began to loosen its grip on Europe in the early 1350s, the continent was left reeling in its wake. The Black Death had taken a staggering toll, with estimates suggesting that between a third and half of the population had perished. Cities and towns lay abandoned, their streets haunted by the ghosts of the dead. The countryside was dotted with deserted villages and fallow fields, the land itself seeming to mourn the lost generations. Yet even in the depths of despair, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. Across Europe, communities began the slow and painful process of rebuilding, gradually piecing together the shattered remnants of their lives. In the Italian city of Florence, the great poet and scholar Giovanni Boccaccio chronicled the city's halting recovery in his masterpiece, the Decameron. The book's vivid tales of love, lust, and human folly were a testament to the enduring vitality of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable loss. As the immediate threat of the plague receded, people began to venture out of their homes and back into the world. Merchants and tradesmen resumed their business, albeit on a much smaller scale. The great fairs and markets that had once been the lifeblood of the medieval economy slowly sputtered back to life as people cautiously began to trade and barter once again. In the countryside, the survivors took stock of their diminished numbers and began the backbreaking work of rebuilding. With so many hands lost to the plague, labour was in short supply, and those who remained could command higher wages and better working conditions. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power between lord and peasant began to shift, as the great landowners were forced to negotiate with their workers to keep their estates running. This newfound bargaining power would have profound implications for the social and economic order of medieval Europe. In England, the plague's aftermath saw the rise of a new class of yeoman farmers, smallholders who were able to acquire land and achieve a measure of economic independence. In France, the plague's disruption of the feudal system would plant the seeds of the great peasant revolts of the 14th and 15th centuries, as the downtrodden masses began to assert their rights and demand a better life. But the plague's impact wasn't limited to the economic and social spheres. It also left an indelible mark on the art, culture, and intellectual life of medieval Europe. In the wake of the Black Death, a new strain of morbid fascination emerged in European art and literature, as painters and writers grappled with the spectre of mortality that had haunted their world. In England, the great poet Geoffrey Chaucer penned his Canterbury Tales in the plague's aftermath, a sprawling work that captured the full spectrum of medieval society in all its complexity and contradiction. In the Pardoner's Tale, Chaucer grappled with the theme of greed and its consequences, while in the Knight's Tale, he explored the enduring power of love in the face of death and destruction. On the stage, the plague's legacy could be seen in the emergence of a new dramatic form, the morality play. These allegorical works, which featured characters representing abstract qualities like vice and virtue, were meant to teach moral lessons and guide the audience towards a righteous life. The most famous of these plays, Every Man, grappled with the inevitability of death and the importance of living a good and honest life in preparation for the hereafter. But perhaps the most enduring cultural legacy of the Black Death was the way it transformed people's relationship with religion. In the face of such overwhelming tragedy, many found solace in a more personal and direct connection with God. The plague years saw a surge in mysticism and devotional practices, as people sought to forge a closer bond with the divine. One of the most striking examples of this trend was the rise of the Brethren of the Common Life, a lay religious movement that emphasized humility, simplicity, and a direct relationship with God. Founded by the Dutch scholar Geert Grout in the late 14th century, the Brethren rejected the pomp and hierarchy of the established church. Instead, embracing a life of quiet contemplation and service to others. The Brethren's teachings would have a profound influence on the great humanist scholars of the Renaissance, including Erasmus and Thomas à Kempis, whose work, The Imitation of Christ, became one of the most widely read devotional texts of the era. In their emphasis on personal piety and the value of education, the Brethren helped to lay the groundwork for the intellectual and spiritual ferment of the centuries to come. But even as Europe began to emerge from the shadow of the Black Death, the spectre of the plague was never far from people's minds. In the centuries that followed, the disease would return again and again, each time leaving a fresh trail of devastation in its wake. In our final chapter, we'll explore the enduring legacy of the Black Death and its impact on the course of human history. Word count, 853. Part 6. Lasting impact of the Black Death. As the immediate crisis of the Black Death began to recede in the late 14th century, the people of Europe were left to grapple with the profound changes the pandemic had wrought. The plague had claimed countless lives, decimated entire communities, and shaken the very foundations of medieval society. But in the midst of all the destruction and despair, a new Europe was beginning to take shape. One of the most significant effects of the Black Death was the way it transformed the social and economic landscape of the continent. With so many people dead, labour was suddenly in short supply, and workers found themselves in a stronger bargaining position than ever before. Across Europe, wages began to rise and working conditions began to improve, as the great landowners and merchants were forced to compete for the services of a dwindling pool of labourers. This shift in the balance of power would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Europe. In England, the plague years saw the rise of a new class of yeoman farmers and craftsmen who were able to take advantage of the new economic opportunities to achieve a measure of prosperity and independence. In Italy, the Black Death helped to fuel the growth of the great merchant republics of Venice and Genoa, as the plague's disruption of the old trade routes opened up new avenues for commerce and enterprise. But the plague's impact wasn't limited to the economic sphere. It also had a profound effect on the intellectual and cultural life of Europe, as scholars and artists grappled with the existential questions posed by the pandemic. In the universities and monasteries of Europe, a new spirit of inquiry began to take hold, as thinkers sought to understand the natural world and the place of humanity within it. One of the most important figures in this intellectual awakening was the English Franciscan friar Roger Bacon. A brilliant polymath with a wide-ranging curiosity, Bacon was a fierce advocate for the use of observation and experimentation in the pursuit of knowledge. In his most famous work, the Opus Majus, he argued that true understanding could only be achieved through the careful study of nature, rather than the blind reliance on ancient authorities. Bacon's ideas would have a profound influence on the development of modern science, paving the way for the great discoveries of the Renaissance and beyond. But he was far from the only thinker to be shaped by the experience of the Black Death. Across Europe, scholars and writers were grappling with the big questions posed by the pandemic, from the nature of God and the meaning of suffering, to the proper role of government in times of crisis. In Italy, the great poet and humanist Petrarch penned his celebrated Triumphs, a series of allegorical poems that explored the themes of love, death, and fame. In The Triumph of Death, Petrarch grappled with the fleeting nature of earthly glory and the inevitability of mortality, themes that would resonate with readers for centuries to come. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Black Death was the way it transformed people's understanding of public health and disease prevention. In the aftermath of the plague, cities across Europe began to take steps to improve sanitation and hygiene, from the construction of new water systems to the establishment of quarantine measures for ships and travellers. In the Italian city of Venice, the authorities established the world's first permanent quarantine station on the island of Lazaretto Nuovo, where incoming ships were required to anchor for 40 days before being allowed to enter the city. The Venetians also pioneered the use of health passes for travellers, a practice that would become widespread in the centuries to come. But even as Europe began to recover from the ravages of the Black Death, the spectre of the plague was never far from people's minds. In the centuries that followed, the disease would return again and again, each time leaving a fresh trail of destruction in its wake. In the 17th century, the Italian city of Milan lost a third of its population to the plague, while in London, the Great Plague of 1665 to 1666 claimed the lives of over 100,000 people. Yet even in the face of such unimaginable tragedy, the human spirit proved resilient. In the aftermath of each new outbreak, people picked up the pieces as the plague tightened its grip on Europe, social order began to fray and break down. With so many dead and dying, there was no one left to enforce the law or maintain the structures of everyday life. Fields lay fallow as farmers succumbed to the pestilence. Shops stood empty, their owners carried off to mass graves. In many towns and villages, the living were scarcely able to bury the dead. Amid this chaos, some gave in to their worst impulses. Looting and lawlessness became commonplace as desperate survivors scavenged for food and valuables in abandoned homes. Paranoia and suspicion ran rampant, with neighbour turning against neighbour in the scramble to stay alive. Some blamed the plague on outsiders and minorities. Across Europe, Jewish communities suffered bloody pogroms and persecutions, accused of deliberately poisoning wells to spread the pestilence. In 1349, the Jewish inhabitants of Strasbourg were rounded up and burned alive on a wooden platform in the city's cemetery. Similar atrocities played out in Cologne, Mainz, and other German cities, as terrified Christians lashed out at convenient scapegoats. Even the church, normally a pillar of stability in medieval society, was thrown into upheaval by the plague. So many priests and monks perished that there were scarcely enough clergy left to provide last rites to the dying. Some men of God abandoned their flocks altogether, fleeing to the countryside in a desperate bid to escape infection. Others resorted to extreme measures in hopes of appeasing what they saw as God's wrath made manifest. One of the most remarkable examples was the flagellants, bands of penitents who roamed from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in acts of masochistic devotion. The flagellants had their origins in Central Europe, but the movement quickly spread in the plague. Years of the late 1340s groups of men, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, marched barefoot between cities, chanting hymns and prayers as they went. Clad in white robes marked with red crosses, they carried scourges of knotted leather straps tipped with iron spikes. Upon reaching a town, the flagellants would assemble in the main square, forming a circle around a leader who preached impassioned sermons on sin and redemption. At a signal, the men would strip to the waist and flog their own backs to the bone, splattering the cobblestones with blood. The flagellants performed this grisly ritual 3 times a day for 33 days, symbolizing Christ's 33 years on earth. Shocking as these displays were, the flagellants initially enjoyed widespread support from a populace desperate for relief from the plague. Many townsfolk welcomed them as holy men, offering food and shelter and even joining their processions. The penitents claimed that their blood mingled with Christ's, giving them the power to perform miracles and absolve sins without priestly intercession. However, church leaders soon grew alarmed by the flagellants' swelling ranks and radical ideas. The Pope condemned them as heretics and urged the faithful to place their trust in prayer and the sacraments, not exhibitionist displays of penance. By the early 1350s, the movement was on the wane, as many flagellants succumbed to the very plague they aimed to avert. the authorities cracked down hard on those who persisted in the practice. In 1349, the King of England ordered the arrest of all flagellants in his realm. The consistory court of Liège condemned the movement's ringleaders to perpetual imprisonment. Flagellant groups still surface sporadically in later years, but never again on the same scale as during the Black Death. The story of the flagellants is a fascinating, if gruesome, example of how some Europeans responded to the plague with desperate acts of fanaticism. It's a testament to the Black Death's power to upend even the most deeply held beliefs and practices of medieval society. Next, let's explore how, even in the darkest days of the plague, there were still glimmers of hope and resilience, the everyday heroes who risked their lives to care for the sick and keep their communities functioning as best they could. Even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit endured. As the plague dragged on year after year, the death toll mounted to staggering heights. It's estimated that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death wiped out anywhere from a third to half of Europe's population, as many as 50 million people. Some regions suffered worse than others. In Italy, the fatalities may have reached 50 to 60%. In parts of France and England, up to 70% perished. The medieval world was accustomed to death on a certain scale. High infant mortality, perennial famine, the occasional bad flu season, but the plague slaughter defied belief. It left behind a blasted landscape of empty villages, crumbling infrastructure, and decimated families. In many places, there was scarcely anyone left to work the fields, tend to the sick, or bury the dead. Yet even in the depths of the catastrophe, there were still those who rose to the occasion with extraordinary courage and selflessness. Consider the example of Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler from the Italian city of Siena. In 1348, the plague struck Siena with devastating force, killing over half the population in just a few months. Amid the chaos and carnage, Di Tura took it upon himself to organize proper Christian burials for the victims, many of whom were dumped unceremoniously in mass graves. He recorded the names of the deceased and saw to it that they were interred with prayers and rites. It was a Herculean task and a terribly dangerous one. Handling plague-ridden corpses was almost a certain death sentence. But Di Tura carried on as long as he could, laying his fellow citizens to rest with a scrap of dignity. Similar acts of quiet heroism played out across Europe, as priests, nuns, and monastics worked on the front lines of the plague response. In Lübeck, a city in northern Germany, the local archbishop led a procession through the streets to bless the sick and console the grieving. In Austria, monks at the Abbey of Zwettl threw open their doors and turned the monastery into a makeshift hospital, nursing plague victims without regard for their own safety. Many of these men and women sacrificed their lives in the effort to bring succor to the suffering. There were moments of extraordinary resilience from the infected as well. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio left a first-hand account of Florence in the grips of the plague. He describes the breakdown of social structures, widespread terror, and the mad ramblings of those in the throes of pestilential fever. But he also notes how some of the afflicted fought to the last with every fibre of their being, clinging to life against all odds. Some dragged their exhausted bodies into churches, Boccaccio wrote, while others locked themselves in their own houses. There were even those who, nursed by the love of their kinsfolk, and no doctor's advice with avail, overcame the foulness of the fatal sore by sheer determination to live. In London, the sufferings of the poor took centre stage. The plague hit the city's crowded slums with particular cruelty, scything through households and leaving countless children orphaned and destitute. In response, the city's leaders passed the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, which placed restrictions on wages and prices in a bid to stave off total economic collapse. The wealthy also stepped up with acts of charity. Sir Walter Manny, a knight in the service of King Edward III, donated a plot of land in London's Smithfield district for use as an emergency burial ground. The site, which became known as East Smithfield, ultimately accommodated over 2,400 plague dead. Archaeological excavations at East Smithfield have yielded poignant glimpses into these anonymous victims. A young woman buried, cradling a 5-month-old infant to her chest, a little girl with a necklace of cheap beads. Even in the bleakest moments, there were still flickers of determined normalcy. In the university town of Cambridge, students and masters defiantly carried on with their lessons, despite the devastation unfolding around them. Colleges imposed strict quarantine measures, sealing themselves off from the outside world as much as possible. Somehow they managed to keep the lamps of learning lit, while so much else fell to darkness. These stories of selflessness, resilience, and stubborn hope are as much a part of the plague years as the horrors we so often focus on. They're a reminder that even in the most extreme circumstances, human beings are still capable of acts of profound decency and courage. The Black Death brought out the worst in some people, but it also brought out the best in others. As the plague finally began to loosen its grip in the early 1350s, the survivors slowly began the work of rebuilding their shattered world. It would be a long and difficult process, but the ordeal had also sown seeds of transformation that would ultimately reshape European society in surprising ways. In our next section, we'll explore some of the far-reaching consequences of the Black Death, how it rocked the foundations of the feudal system, opened up new opportunities for women and the lower classes, and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and Reformation yet to come. The Black Death was an unimaginable tragedy, but it was also, in some ways, a turning point in history. As the plague's second wave surged across Europe, entire towns and regions were practically wiped off the map. The Italian writer Boccaccio lamented that such was the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day and every hour that there was not enough consecrated ground to give them burial. In Avignon, France, the home of the papal court, over half the city's population perished in just a few months. One chronicler described bodies piling up in mass graves like layers of fish. Many towns simply ceased to exist. The English village of Pendlebury went from 66 households in 1346 to just 8 survivors by 1351. Some villages lost 70 to 80% of their inhabitants. Amid such devastation, social order began to fray. With so many dead, normal life ground to a halt. Crops withered in fields with no one to tend them. Valuable possessions lay abandoned in empty houses. The stench of death permeated the air. Boccaccio wrote of Florence. The plight of the lower and most of the middle classes was even more pitiful to behold. Most of them remained in their houses, either through poverty or in hopes of safety, and fell sick by thousands. Many ended their lives in the streets, at night or in broad daylight. Of many others who died at home, the neighbours, more interested in the stench of their rotting bodies than usurped by charity toward the dead, discovered their passing perhaps only by the putrid feta. Anarchy and lawlessness reigned. Bands of thieves roamed the countryside, looting abandoned homes. Merchants gouged prices on dwindling food and supplies. Neighbour turned against neighbour in growing paranoia. Anyone who so much as coughed or looked pale might be driven away or even stoned to death. Jews especially suffered persecution. Accused of poisoning wells or practicing witchcraft to spread the pestilence, thousands of Jews were burned alive or brutally massacred. In Strasbourg, over 900 Jews were publicly burned in a single day in February 1349. By the time the violence ended, over 200 Jewish communities had been eradicated. Even the church, which offered the only sliver of hope to the pious, was in turmoil. Nearly 40% of the clergy had perished. The Pope consecrated the River Rhone to allow bodies to be dumped en masse. Survivors questioned how a merciful God could inflict such suffering. One group who tried to take matters into their own hands were the flagellants. Clad in white robes, faces and chests bare, they marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody to atone for the sins they believed had brought the plague. Led by a defrocked priest, Conrad Schmidt, one group of 200 flagellants marched 700 miles from Holland to Aachen, their numbers swelling to over 400. Twice a day, the flagellants would stage their macabre ritual, reading aloud a heavenly letter that had supposedly fallen from the sky in Jerusalem. Then they would flog themselves with leather straps studded with iron spikes, all the while singing penitent hymns. The spikes tore their flesh to a pulp. After the performance, the flagellants would doff their blood-soaked garments and throw themselves to the ground in the shape of a cross, pleading for merciful intercession. At first, the flagellants were welcomed in towns and villages, the desperate populace eager to participate in the scourging and join their processions. But when this self-mortification failed to stop the plague's advance, sentiment turned against them. The Pope condemned their heretical practices, accusing them of spreading disease and defying church authority. Faced with threats of excommunication and arrest, the flagellant movement withered. As the weeks stretched into months, every level of society felt the plague's merciless squeeze. With workers dying in droves and survivors demanding higher wages, desperate landlords tried to coerce tenants to remain as serfs. In England, King Edward III issued an ordinance freezing wages at pre-plague levels. Guilds instituted new rules to limit competition from outsiders for diminished jobs. The plague disrupted the very rhythm of medieval life. Church bells, which normally rang in a soothing daily cycle of calls to prayer, now tolled endlessly to signal the dead and dying. Mass graves couldn't be dug fast enough. Bodies were heaped in piles or dumped into rivers. The parish priest John Clyn of Ireland confessed in his journal that he wrote, "Waiting among the dead for death to come." Amid the devastation, however, there were glimmers of selflessness and hope. While many clergy abandoned their flocks, others stayed to minister to the sick and perform last rites, paying with their lives. Doctors like Guy de Chauliac, who later wrote a famous account of the plague, never stopped tending to patients despite the risks. Some towns managed to weather the storm through sheer determination and solidarity. In the Derbyshire village of Ayam, the villagers voluntarily quarantined themselves to prevent the plague from spreading to neighbouring towns after their own tailor inadvertently brought the pestilence north from London in a parcel of cloth. Under the leadership of their rector, William Mompesson, the villagers left money in vinegar-filled holes in boundary rocks in exchange for food and supplies left by the neighbouring villages. Though Ayam lost over half its population, their sacrifice likely saved many more. As the Black Death finally began to subside in the early 1350s, it left a Europe that was utterly transformed. Between a third to half the population had been wiped out, an estimated 75 to 200 million dead. Survivors emerged as if from a daze, traumatized and disoriented, to bury their loved ones and rebuild their shattered lives and livelihoods. The plague's passage was indelibly burnt into the collective psyche. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common motif in art and literature, depicting the skeletal figure of death leading people from all walks of life in a morbid procession to the grave. It was a reminder that no one, whether peasant or king, could escape death's grasp. Yet, as the shadow of the Black Death slowly lifted, there were surprising signs of rejuvenation and resilience. Abandoned land was recultivated. Towns and cities began to bustle again with returning survivors and new migrants. With the population so diminished, serfs and peasants found themselves in high demand. They agitated for higher wages and better conditions, leading to a gradual loosening of the rigid feudal system. Medicine and public health also saw advances. The miasma theory, which held that disease spread through poisonous vapors, gained new adherents and spurred sanitation efforts. Survivors of the plague mysteriously seemed to have immunity, a key observation that contributed to later inoculation practices. The influx of rural migrants revitalized cities and sparked cultural innovations that would blossom into the Renaissance. Through a mosaic of vividly drawn vignettes, we've traced the Black Death's grim passage through the 14th century. We've seen how this epidemic devastated medieval society, yet also planted seeds of social transformation and resilience. In a pattern that has echoed through history, crisis and suffering laid bare both the darkest and most noble aspects of human nature. The voices and stories we've heard stand as a testament to the fortitude and spirit of those who endured one of history's most trying times. Young Guillaume le Muet, his thumbs and index fingers gangrenous from the plague, bravely learning to write again. Marie Felicie, caring tirelessly for the dying in a Parisian hospital. Brother Maurice, the Benedictine monk of Westminster Abbey, faithfully chronicling the plague's toll, even as his fellow monks succumbed one by one. These medieval lives can feel both colourfully foreign and strikingly familiar to us today. While separated by centuries, we walk in their footsteps each time we grapple with the primal fears and communal challenges of our own pandemics and disasters. In their tragedies, we see our own pain. In their perseverance, we find hope. The Black Death's shadow would linger for generations, its mysteries unsolved, until modern science could decipher the DNA of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. But the human spirit cannot be so easily decoded. The men and women of the Middle Ages stared into the face of their society's near collapse. In their suffering and their resilience, they left us a complex portrait of a world upended yet determined to endure. Through the 1340s and into the early 1350s, the Black Death tightened its grip on medieval Europe. No corner of the continent was spared from the pestilence. From large cities to tiny hamlets, the plague infiltrated communities and decimated populations with startling speed and merciless efficiency. In many of the worst affected areas, over half the population would succumb to the disease in a matter of months. Some villages and towns were completely wiped off the map, their names forever lost to history. The sheer scale of death was unlike anything Europe had ever experienced. It's estimated that the Black Death claimed between 75 and 200 million lives in just a few years. Eyewitness accounts paint a grim picture of the plague's relentless onslaught. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio describes the scene in Florence. Such was the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day and every hour that there was not enough consecrated ground to give them burial. When all the graves were full, huge trenches were dug in the churchyards, into which new arrivals were placed in layers, as one stows merchandise on a ship. Similar scenes played out in towns and cities across Europe. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. Many were unceremoniously dumped into mass graves, denied the usual respectful rites of passage. The stench of death hung heavily over medieval streets and squares. It seemed to many that the apocalypse had truly arrived. Amid this atmosphere of devastation and dread, a few tales of heroic self-sacrifice stand out. The small village of Ayam in central England is one such example. When the plague arrived in Ayam in 1665, centuries after the initial Black Death, but during a later outbreak, the villagers made an extraordinary decision. Rather than flee and risk spreading the disease to neighbouring towns, they voluntarily quarantined themselves. Under the leadership of their courageous rector William Mompesson, the people of Ayam stoically accepted their fate. They ceased all travel and trade with the outside world. Knowing they were likely doomed, the villagers focused on containing the plague to protect others. For 14 months, Ayam battled the pestilence alone. When the ordeal finally ended, over 75% of the village had perished. but not a single surrounding community caught the plague. The heroic sacrifice of the villagers of Eyam saved countless lives. Unfortunately, such nobility was all too rare during the Black Death. Far more common was a descent into panic, paranoia, and every man for himself lawlessness. As the usual social order crumbled, dark human impulses rushed to fill the void. Theft and banditry became rampant. Towns barricaded themselves against desperate refugees. The plague shook people's faith to the core. Rather than banding together, many took to wild superstition and misdirected blame. A tragically common scapegoat were Europe's Jewish communities. Unfounded rumours swirled that Jews had poisoned wells and caused the plague. Vicious pogroms saw thousands of innocent Jews massacred across Europe. In Strasbourg, the entire Jewish population was herded into a wooden building and burned alive. It was one of the darkest chapters of the Black Death. Other people took the opposite approach, believing the plague was God's just punishment for humanity's sins. The flagellants were a notorious band of penitents who roamed Europe during the plague years, publicly flogging themselves as a form of atonement. They believed that by vigorously whipping themselves with scourges and lashes studded with sharp spikes, they could redirect God's wrath and atone for worldly wickedness. Bands of flagellants, naked to the waist and chanting mournful hymns, became a common sight on Europe's roads. Led by fanatical doomsayers, their numbers swelled into the hundreds and thousands. However, the flagellants' theological arguments were shaky at best. Pope Clement VI denounced them as heretics and a danger to public order. Ironically, the flagellants' mass gatherings may have merely helped spread the plague. Not to mention their open wounds were an invitation to infection. Amid the chaos and trauma of the Black Death, medical science was woefully ill-equipped to combat the pestilence. The true cause of the plague, a bacterial infection spread by fleas, lay centuries in the future. Medieval doctors, relying on ancient Greek theories of bodily humours, were baffled by the disease's virulence and spread. Common treatments included bloodletting, boil lancing, and the application of frogs and leeches. Some physicians wore long, ominous beak-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, believed to keep bad air at bay. Their ghostly, foreboding costumes are an enduring symbol of the plague years. As one might expect, medieval medicine proved largely useless against the Black Death. If anything, many treatments weakened the body's natural defences and worsened a patient's odds of survival. With no cure in sight, a sense of hopelessness and resignation settled over Europe. Art and culture turned increasingly morbid, reflecting the era's inescapable atmosphere of death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a common motif in medieval paintings, frescoes, and woodcuts. These grim works depicted skeletal figures of death leading people from all walks of life in a final, haunting dance. Pauper and king, young maiden and wizened crone, all cavorted together under death's grinning dominion. The message was clear. The plague made equals of all, and none could escape the reaper's inexorable summons. Other artistic responses were more poignant than morbid. Giovanni Boccaccio's masterpiece, The Decameron, is set amid the plague's ravages in Florence. It tells of 10 young nobles who flee to the countryside, where they pass the time telling each other stories. 100 tales of love, lust, wit, and folly. On one level, it's a work of escapism, an attempt to find humour and humanity amid the horror. But the plague is always there as a backdrop, a reminder of life's fragility and preciousness. Poetry of the time, too, grappled with the Black Death's enormity. The English author Geoffrey Chaucer composed his famous work, The Canterbury Tales, in the plague's aftermath. While the pestilence is not the poem's main focus, its shadow looms over the text. Chaucer's diverse cast of pilgrims, the knight, the monk, the miller, the wife of Bath, are all survivors, making one last earthly journey together. Their stories are shot through with a vivid immediacy, a seize-the-day spirit forged by the plague's fires. As the 1350s progressed, the Black Death gradually lost momentum. Some scholars speculate that the bacterium evolved to become less virulent over time. Or perhaps there were simply fewer vulnerable hosts to infect after the first feverish waves. Whatever the reason, outbreaks became more sporadic and contained. Europeans slowly emerged from their long collective nightmare. The aftershocks, of course, would continue for generations. The Black Death left medieval society deeply traumatized. Historians estimate that Europe's population wouldn't return to its pre-plague levels until the 1500s. Farms lay fallow. Guilds struggled to replace skilled artisans. Monasteries, their monks wiped out, fell into ruin. The medieval world that reappeared after the plague was in many ways a vastly different place than what came before. And yet, Europeans endured. Slowly and painfully, they rebuilt their lives from the ashes. Bit by bit, towns grew bustling again. Economies spluttered back to life. Widowed spouses remarried and had children. Life, with all its joys and sorrows, went on. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, that will to keep going even after the darkest of dark ages. In the decades after the Black Death, a few surprising social changes began to take root. Perhaps most significantly, the immense loss of life actually improved living standards for many of those who survived. With labour suddenly in short supply, workers and peasants found themselves with newfound bargaining power. Wages rose. Landlords offered better terms to attract tenants. Social mobility increased as enterprising commoners moved into roles left vacant by the plague. Some historians see the Black Death as a tipping point that began the slow decline of medieval feudalism. With so many nobles felled by the pestilence, the rigid hierarchy that had governed Europe for centuries started to loosen. A new middle class began to assert itself. The plague sowed seeds of change that would, in time, lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the birth of the modern world. The Black Death also sparked long overdue advances in medicine and public health. After centuries of stagnation, the field of epidemiology began to emerge, as scholars tracked the plague's patterns and sought new methods of containment. The value of quarantine as a public health tool was recognized and refined. Cities developed better sanitation systems, with designated waste removal and fresh water supplies. While progress was slow and fitful, the hard lessons of the Black Death were gradually absorbed. Philosophically and spiritually too, medieval Europe was deeply affected by its harrowing brush with mortality. For some, the plague shook their faith in God and the Church. How could a just and loving deity inflict such suffering upon the world? Others found their beliefs tempered and deepened by the ordeal. Rather than a vengeful taskmaster, they conceived of God as a source of strength and comfort amid life's tribulations. The Black Death forced Europeans to confront death on an unprecedented scale. In response, many developed a new perspective on life's meaning and purpose. The medieval ideals of chivalry and courtly love, so much preoccupied with earthly vanity, began to ring hollow. A more personal, introspective kind of faith emerged. The seeds of the Renaissance and Reformation were planted in the plague's aftermath, as individuals asserted their right to question authority and seek truth for themselves. These profound cultural shifts are embodied in the era's art and literature. Painters like Giotto began to break from the stiff, formulaic style of Gothic art, crafting figures with new depth, emotion, and humanity. Writers like Dante and Chaucer grappled with questions of sin, salvation, and life's meaning in their masterworks. A new humanism was emerging, one that placed individual conscience and experience at the center of the search for truth. It would be a mistake, of course, to romanticize the Black Death as a necessary evil that ultimately uplifted Europe. The plague inflicted unimaginable suffering. It traumatized medieval society in ways that can scarcely be fathomed from our modern vantage. The long-term effects on everything from the economy to the arts are debatable and complex. What is undeniable is that those who survived the Black Death demonstrated the incredible resilience of the human spirit. In the face of the worst catastrophe in recorded history, Europeans slowly and painfully found ways to rebuild, regroup, and move forward. As we've seen in our own times with modern pandemics, human beings have a remarkable capacity to adapt, endure, and even find glimmers of hope amid periods of great darkness. The stories of the Black Death survivors are a testament to this resilient spirit. People like Agnolo di Tura, a shoemaker from Siena who buried his 5 children with his own hands, yet found the strength to start anew and raise a second family. Or Guillaume de Machaut, a French composer who lost most of his peers to the pestilence, but channeled his grief into soaring musical tributes to beauty and love. These are just a few of the countless ordinary heroes who quietly kept the flame of human dignity alive during Europe's darkest hour. We'll never truly know what it was like to live through the unrelenting horror of the Black Death. The terrifying ever-presence of death, the grief of losing nearly everyone you love, the gnawing fear of inescapable doom always around the corner. Our minds reel at the thought. And yet, we can find common threads of humanity with our medieval forebears in their determination to carry on, step by step, day by day. In an uncertain world, we could do worse than to remember the hard lessons and hard-won wisdom that emerged from the plague years. Hold your loved ones close, savor life's precious moments, find beauty and meaning where you can. When humanity is tested to its very limits, these are the things that sustain us, that point the way forward through the valley of the shadow. The Black Death remains a haunting spectre in our collective memory, a grim reminder of life's fragility and preciousness. It was an apocalyptic event, unlike any other in human history, one whose echoes still resonate through the centuries. And yet, in the midst of its darkest horrors, the unbreakable power of the human spirit shone through. The determination to carry on, to find hope and joy and love against impossible odds. It's a light that guides us still, a promise that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, life endures. As we reflect on the Black Death's impact and legacy, perhaps the most fitting tribute we can offer is to embrace that same spirit of resilience in our own lives, to meet challenges with courage, to cherish moments of grace, and to never stop striving for a better tomorrow. The road ahead is winding and unsure, but we walk it together, guided by the hard-earned wisdom of those who came before. And though the journey is long, morning always comes at last, the eternal dawn for which we all carry on. Let's turn back now to the tragic tale of the villagers of Iam and their noble sacrifice in the face of unimaginable horror. In the fall of 1665, the bubonic plague arrived in this remote Derbyshire village, likely transported in a bale of cloth sent from London. The first victim was the tailor George Vickers, who swiftly succumbed to the pestilence. As the sickness began to spread, the villagers faced a heart-wrenching choice. They could flee the plague, scattering to nearby towns and villages in hopes of escaping infection. But doing so risked spreading the plague far and wide across the countryside. After agonized deliberation, the villagers chose a different path, one of great courage and sacrifice. Under the guidance of their rector, William Mompesson, and Puritan minister Thomas Stanley, the people of Iam made an extraordinary pact. They would voluntarily quarantine their village. Nobody would be allowed in or out until the plague had run its course. They would cut themselves off from the world, containing the plague but dooming themselves in the process. It was a death sentence, and they knew it. For 14 months, the people of Ayam stuck to their resolve as the plague raged in their midst. They left food and supplies at the village boundary stone and relied on the outside world to do the same. Church services were held outside to minimize contagion. Families had to bury their own dead. The toll was devastating. One woman, Elizabeth Hancock, lost her husband and 6 children in the span of just 8 days. The village tailor and his family were wiped out completely. By the time the plague subsided in October 1666, 260 villagers had perished out of an original population of around 800. The Siddall family was utterly decimated, with only 1 survivor left out of an initial 11. Yet through all the tragedy and horror, the people of Ayam held fast to their quarantine, even as the world outside remained oblivious to their plight and sacrifice. Their selfless act spared the surrounding area from the worst of the plague. While other northern towns and villages were ravaged, the country parishes nearby Ayam saw relatively few cases and deaths. The heroic story of Ayam stands as a testament to the human spirit and capacity for self-sacrifice, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. While their losses were immense, the people of Ayam showed the world the meaning of courage and solidarity. Their legacy endures to this day, forever remembered in the annals of history. As the plague continued its deadly march across Europe, medieval society began to fray and buckle under the strain. With so many dead or dying, crops rotted in the fields and vital trades ground to a halt. The machinery of commerce and everyday life fell apart. People searched desperately for someone to blame, turning on each other in their fear and paranoia. Severe labor shortages caused the price of wages to skyrocket, as a shrinking pool of able-bodied workers gained new bargaining power. Many feudal lords resisted this change, seeking to bind their peasants to the land as they had for generations. But with entire villages depopulated, there was little they could do as serfs abandoned the manor for better prospects elsewhere. The Black Death had begun to undermine the very foundations of feudal society. In the grips of dread and despair, some people turned to wild debauchery, living for the moment as if there were no tomorrow. Others, driven mad by the plague's unspeakable horrors, roamed the land in marauding bands, looting and killing with impunity. The veneer of civilization was starting to crack. Disturbing rumors began to spread that the plague was actually the work of Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells and afflicting their Christian neighbors. These baseless conspiracy theories took hold in the popular imagination, whipped up further by anti-Semitic clergy and political elites. Across Europe, Jewish communities faced a rising tide of persecution and violence. In 1348, as the plague tightened its grip on the Holy Roman Empire, the Jewish population of Strasbourg was rounded up and burned alive in one of the deadliest pogroms of the Middle Ages. The 2,000 Jews then living in the city were given a grim choice: conversion or death. Most refused to abandon their faith and perished in the flames. Similar atrocities played out in Cologne, Mainz, and other German cities as terrified people lashed out at convenient scapegoats. This shameful pattern of persecution would recur across Europe as the plague dragged on. In Basel, 600 Jews were murdered in 1349, their property seized, and their orphan children forcibly baptized. The Jewish communities of Frankfurt and Brussels were utterly destroyed. In Aragon, Jews were subjected to horrible tortures by the Inquisition and pressured to confess to bogus crimes. One man who helped fuel this tide of anti-Semitism was a German priest named Heinrich von Herford. An influential scholar and preacher, von Herford delivered fiery sermons, accusing Jews of spreading the plague and calling for their expulsion. He claimed that Jews had made a pact with Satan to undermine Christendom, and that the plague was God's punishment on mankind. Von Herford's incendiary words found a receptive audience among frightened Christians looking for someone to blame. Spreading like wildfire, his malicious accusations fanned the flames of hatred and paranoia, lending a veneer of legitimacy to the worst impulses of the mob. Though he is little remembered today, von Herford played a key role in inciting anti-Semitic violence during the Black Death. As Jew and Gentile alike suffered under the plague's merciless scourge, von Herford sowed seeds of suspicion and division, casting a community already in crisis into further turmoil. It would take generations for Europe's Jewish population to recover from the devastation wrought during these years. The Black Death was not just a crisis of mortality, but of solidarity and social cohesion. Indeed, as the plague wore on, acts of scapegoating and persecution were often accompanied by outpourings of mysticism and penitent self-flagellation. Zealous laypeople, known as the flagellants, whipped themselves into a frenzy, traveling from town to town, preaching repentance and redemption through suffering. As the wretched buboes spread, bringing agony and death in their wake, the people of Europe found themselves increasingly gripped by paranoia and superstition. In their desperate search for someone to blame, many turned their ire on society's most vulnerable and marginalized. The Jews, in particular, found themselves in the crosshairs of persecution. Long scapegoated and distrusted across medieval Europe, they now became widely accused of deliberately spreading the pestilence. Wild rumors swirled that Jews were poisoning wells, plotting to destroy Christendom, or colluding with dark forces to unleash the plague. Such baseless conspiracy theories spread like wildfire in the midst of panic and social breakdown. In Toulon, France, the Jewish community was viciously attacked in the spring of 1348, with rioters burning the Jewish quarter and massacring scores of innocents. By year's end, hundreds of Jewish communities had been destroyed across Europe, from Spain to Switzerland to Germany. Tragically, one of the most notorious of these attacks unfolded in the city of Strasbourg. In February 1349, a mob of enraged townsfolk and peasants from the surrounding countryside descended upon the Jewish quarter. They forcibly gathered the city's 2,000 Jews, herded them onto a wooden platform erected in the cemetery, and burned them alive in a single night of horrific bloodshed. The few who agreed to be baptized as Christians were spared. These grotesque pogroms stand among history's darker chapters, fueled by a toxic brew of fear, desperation, and ancient prejudices. But the Jews were not the only targets of persecution during the Black Death's miserable reign. Lepers, the poor, foreigners, beggars, Romani, virtually anyone on the margins of society became potential scapegoats. In some regions, the sick were dragged from their homes and left to perish in the streets. The merest accusation of bringing sickness could prompt a swift and brutal retaliation in those fear-soaked times. Yet even as Europeans lashed out at the vulnerable in their midst, the plague paid no mind to distinctions of race, creed, or class. Death rained down upon rich and poor alike, humbling prince and pauper, collapsing social hierarchies like flimsy houses of cards. Among those who found themselves brought low was the Princess Joan of England. The daughter of King Edward III, Joan was but 14 when her father arranged for her to wed 13-year-old Prince Pedro of Castile in a bid to strengthen England's alliance with Spain. In the summer of 1348, the princess set out to meet her groom, travelling with an entourage of ladies, courtiers and servants. But this grand procession would never reach its destination. As the royal party passed through France, the telltale signs of sickness began to appear. First, a handmaiden took ill, racked by fevers and chills. Then several guards. Soon the pestilence was spreading through the caravan at a terrifying clip. Young Joan could only watch in horror as, one by one, her companions succumbed to agonizing deaths all around her. The teenager found herself stranded in the plague-ravaged landscape, her royal rank useless against the sickness that now besieged her body. After a valiant 2-week struggle, the princess finally breathed her last in Bordeaux in September 1348, without ever meeting her betrothed. Joan's tragic tale underscores the great levelling brought by the Black Death. High birth offered no protection when the plague winds blew. Indeed, the well-to-do and high-born often fared worse than commoners, as their more lavish lifestyles granted greater exposure to the pestilence. Many a noble family found their lineages abruptly snuffed out, grand estates reduced to ghostly, echoing chambers. In the Duchy of Gloucester, for example, the plague cut a vicious swath through the nobility in late 1348 and early 1349. The Duke, the Earl, and a sobering share of the region's knights and gentry all perished in rapid succession, leaving a gaping power vacuum. The surviving aristocrats found themselves scrambling to assert control and marshal what remained of their decimated ranks. Similar scenarios unfolded across Europe, as the plague shredded long-held status quos and threw entrenched hierarchies into disarray. The Catholic Church, a pillar of stability for centuries, reeled as clergymen died in droves. The sight of once revered priests and bishops, faces pocked with suppurating sores, dying in misery like any other wretch, badly tarnished the Church's aura of divine authority in many people's eyes. Some, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bradwardine, strove valiantly to lead their flock through the valley of death. The Archbishop worked tirelessly to ease the suffering of the afflicted and offer spiritual comfort, modelling Christian charity and steadfastness until the pestilence felled him in August 1349. Alas, for every Bradwardine, there were scores of clergymen who fled their parishes in terror or hid behind abbey walls as the plague raged. This abdication of moral leadership, combined with the plague's horrific toll among the clergy, left the Church badly weakened, its foundations cracked. While it would retain immense power and influence, the Black Death had planted the seeds for the coming upheavals of the Reformation era. Yet amid the many grim tales of the plague years, there were also glimmers of light, of selflessness and resilience rising out of the darkest depths. Communities came together, neighbours aiding one another as best they could. Women often found themselves thrust into new positions of leadership as male heads of household perished. Some skilled physicians, apothecaries, and folk healers worked to the point of exhaustion to alleviate the suffering around them, knowing they might pay with their lives. And through it all, there remained that most tenacious spark: hope. Hope that this ravaging storm would soon blow over. Hope that the relentless scythe of death would pass the next house by. Hope that the Lord's mercy would spare a beloved child, husband, sister, friend. Fragile yet stubborn, this flicker of hope sustained many through the very worst of times, an inner light to ward off the darkness. For as deep as the suffering gouged, as heavy as the losses weighed, the people endured, survived, slowly rebuilt from the ashes and bones. Life, in all its sorrow and sweetness, went on in a world forever altered. A world that would never forget the plague's cruel lessons, even as it grew toward a new dawn. As the flagellants made their way across Europe, whipping themselves into a pious frenzy, the plague continued its relentless march. No corner of the continent was spared its ravages. From the sun-baked shores of Sicily to the misty moors of Scotland, the spectre of death hung heavy in the air. One of the most harrowing accounts of this time comes from the Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio. In his masterwork, the Decameron, he describes the plague's toll on his native Florence. "The pestilence," he writes, "gathered strength as it spread, growing ever more deadly. Such fear filled the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often wife abandoned husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children, as if they had not been theirs." Boccaccio's words paint a chilling picture of a society in collapse, the bonds of family and community fraying under the weight of sheer terror. And yet, even in this darkest of hours, there were still those who rose above the panic and self-preservation. Consider the case of Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler from the Tuscan city of Siena. As the plague tightened its grip on the city, Agnolo took it upon himself to record the names of the dead, so that they might not be forgotten. Day after day, he traversed the stricken city, cataloguing the fallen with meticulous care. By the time the plague had run its course, Agnolo had filled several volumes with the names of his fellow citizens, a poignant testament to the magnitude of the loss. But Agnolo's work was more than just a grim accounting. In a time when so many died alone and unmourned, his records served as a kind of surrogate eulogy, ensuring that each victim was remembered as a unique individual, rather than just another number in a staggering death toll. In this small but meaningful way, Agnolo helped to preserve the humanity of his city, even as the plague did its best to erase it. Similar acts of quiet heroism could be found throughout Europe during this dark time. In the French city of Rouen, a group of nuns known as the Sisters of Hôtel Dieu tended to the sick and dying, even as their own ranks were decimated by the pestilence. In England, a monk named John Clyn dutifully recorded the plague's progress through his abbey, peppering his sombre account with moments of grace and self-sacrifice. These stories serve as a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary resilience and compassion. They are the candles that flicker bravely against the engulfing darkness, the tiny triumphs that defy despair. As the plague finally began to loosen its grip on Europe in the early 1350s, the continent was a changed place. It is estimated that between a third and half of the population had been wiped out, a staggering loss that would take centuries to recover from. Villages stood empty, their inhabitants carried off by the pestilence. Fields lay fallow, trade routes fell silent, and the great cities were shadows of their former selves. But amidst the ruin and despair, there were also signs of renewal. With the drastic reduction in population, labour suddenly became a precious commodity. Peasants, who had once been bound to the land as serfs, found themselves in high demand, able to command wages and conditions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The rigid hierarchy of the feudal system began to crumble as a new social order took shape. In the realm of art and culture, the plague left an indelible mark. The sombre motif of the danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common sight in churches and public squares, a grim reminder of the fragility of life. At the same time, there was a renewed appreciation for the pleasures of the here and now, as evidenced by the rise of humanism and the flourishing of vernacular literature. One of the most striking examples of this post-plague sensibility can be found in the work of Geoffrey Chaucer. Writing in the 1380s, a generation after the worst of the pestilence had passed, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are infused with a vivacity and earthiness that feels like a direct response to the austerity of the plague years. His pilgrims, from the bawdy wife of Bath to the worldly monk, are vivid, flesh and blood creations, reveling in the simple joys of food, drink, and companionship. Chaucer's masterpiece is a testament to the enduring power of storytelling and to the human capacity for finding light in even the darkest of times. It reminds us that, no matter how bleak the circumstances, there is always room for laughter, for fellowship, and for hope. As we look back on the Black Plague from the vantage point of the 21st century, it can be hard to fathom the scale of the devastation it wrought. The idea of losing half the world's population to a single disease seems almost unimaginable, a catastrophe more suited to dystopian fiction than historical fact. And yet, the lessons of the plague are as relevant today as they were 700 years ago. In a world still grappling with pandemics, both literal and metaphorical, the Black Death serves as a sobering reminder of our own vulnerability and of the urgent need for compassion and solidarity in the face of shared crisis. At the same time, the stories of those who lived through the plague, the poets and the chroniclers, the nuns and the monks, offer a glimmer of hope in the darkness. They remind us that, even in the midst of unthinkable suffering, the human spirit is capable of remarkable acts of kindness, courage, and creativity. As we navigate our own uncertain times, we would do well to remember their example. To remember that, no matter how dire the circumstances, there is always the potential for renewal and rebirth, that even the darkest night must eventually give way to dawn. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Black Plague, that, in the face of devastation and despair, the only true antidote is to cling to our shared humanity, to reach out to one another with compassion and empathy, and to find strength in the bonds of community. It is a lesson that echoes down through the centuries, as relevant now as it was in the plague-stricken streets of medieval Europe. And it is a lesson that, if we can take it to heart, may just see us through our own darkest hours and into a brighter, more hopeful future. As we come to the end of our journey through the shadow of the Black Death, let us take a moment to remember those who lived and died during that terrible time. The countless souls who were lost to the pestilence, and the brave few who fought to preserve the light of human kindness in a world gone mad. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a reminder that even in the face of the greatest adversity, hope and compassion will always find a way to endure. May their memory be a blessing, and may their example inspire us to face our own challenges with grace, courage, and an unshakable faith in the power of our shared humanity. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us carry their stories with us into our dreams. Let us find comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come. And let us wake in the morning with renewed resolve to build a world of greater kindness, compassion, and hope. A world that would make those long ago survivors of the Black Death proud. Good night and sweet dreams. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, entire towns were decimated. Eyewitness accounts paint a grim picture of the pestilence's relentless onslaught. In Florence, Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio lamented that such fear and fanciful notions took possession of the living that almost all of them adopted the same cruel policy, which was entirely to avoid the sick and everything belonging to them. By so doing, each one thought he would secure his own safety. The plague respected no boundaries of class or status. In England, King Edward III's own daughter, Princess Joan, succumbed to the disease on her way to marry Prince Pedro of Castile in 1348. The Scots thought the divine wind was blowing in their favour when the plague struck an invading English army, killing their commander. But the Scots soon suffered their own devastating outbreak, proving that the dreaded pestilence was no respecter of borders. In the French city of Avignon, home to the papal court, the sickness claimed an estimated 50% of the population. Pope Clement VI found himself issuing last rites through the windows as the contagion swept through his own residence. In a desperate attempt to protect himself, the pontiff sat between two constantly burning fires, hoping the heat would ward off the mysterious malady. But still the plague crept ever closer. No corner of Europe was spared the devastation. From Scandinavia to Sicily, the Black Death cast its long shadow. The Italian writer Angelo di Tura poignantly captured the plague's terrible toll, lamenting, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world." In the Norwegian village of Bygland, archaeologists have uncovered a mass grave containing over 100 skeletons, their twisted forms bearing witness to the Black Death's grim passage. In the face of such unimaginable loss, medieval society began to fray at the seams. With so many dead, fields lay fallow and livestock wandered unattended. Food shortages and famine soon followed in the plague's wake. The stench of death hung heavy in the air as corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Many simply fled in terror, desperately seeking to outrun the advancing sickness. The once bustling ports of Europe, lifeblood of medieval trade, became silent ghost towns as the plague paralyzed commerce. In the German city of Bremen, visiting ships were forced to wait 40 days before unloading their cargoes, giving rise to the practice of quarantine. But even this could not stop the spread of the pestilence, which hitched a ride on fleas nestled in the fur of rats. As panic and paranoia mounted, medieval society sought scapegoats for the calamity that had befallen them. Tragically, suspicion often fell on Europe's Jewish communities. In 1349, the citizens of Strasbourg murdered over 900 Jews, burning them alive in a public square. This scene was repeated in cities across Germany and beyond, as fear and ignorance fueled a savage persecution. But even as Europe descended into a maelstrom of death and destruction, there were glimmers of light amidst the darkness. In the English village of Ayam, the courageous clergyman William Mompesson persuaded his parishioners to quarantine themselves to prevent the plague's spread. For 14 months, the villagers stoically endured as the plague slowly decimated their numbers. Their noble sacrifice spared the neighboring towns from infection. Such selfless acts were all too rare in a time of unrelenting horror. Most could only watch helplessly as the Black Death claimed victim after victim, seemingly without end. The Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura captured the plague's grim toll, writing, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world." It must have seemed to many that the apocalypse was at hand. But even the Black Death eventually exhausted itself. By 1351, the worst of the pestilence had passed, leaving a shattered and traumatized Europe in its wake. An estimated 30 to 60% of the continent's population had been wiped out, with some regions losing up to 80% of their inhabitants. It was a demographic catastrophe unparalleled in human history. As the survivors slowly emerged from their boarded-up homes and began to rebuild their shattered lives, they confronted a world profoundly changed. With so much of the workforce lost to the plague, labor was in high demand. Peasants and artisans found themselves able to command wages unthinkable just a few years before. The rigid social hierarchy of feudalism began to crumble. In England, the shortage of labor emboldened peasants to challenge the authority of their noble masters. In 1381, the simmering tensions exploded in the peasants' revolt, a massive uprising that saw thousands of angry serfs march on London, torching buildings and clashing with royal troops. Though the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it signaled a sea change in the relationship between noble and commoner. The Black Death also sparked a renewed interest in science and medicine, as scholars sought to understand and combat the mysterious pestilence. The Italian doctor Marsilio Ficino pioneered the use of aromatic herbs to purify miasmas or tainted air thought to spread disease. His work laid the foundation for the development of modern public health practices. In the realm of religion, the Black Death dealt a heavy blow to the Catholic Church's authority. Many struggled to reconcile the Church's teachings with the plague's seemingly indiscriminate slaughter. The Lollards, a heretical sect that rejected papal authority and championed a vernacular Bible, found fertile ground for their ideas amidst the crisis. Though branded as heretics, their calls for reform foreshadowed the coming Protestant Reformation. The Black Death also left an indelible mark on medieval art and culture. In the plague's aftermath, artists increasingly turned to macabre themes, producing works suffused with images of death and decay. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a grim promenade to the grave. One of the most haunting artistic responses to the plague was the triumph of death, a fresco painted by Francisco Trini in the Italian city of Pisa. The nightmarish scene depicts a towering skeleton, armed with a scythe, presiding over a landscape strewn with corpses. The work captured the sense of helplessness and despair that gripped many in the plague's aftermath. But even amidst the darkness, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. In Florence, a group of young people, immortalized in Boccaccio's Decameron, fled the plague-ravaged city and took refuge in a country villa. There, they whiled away the time telling stories, 100 tales of love, lust, and adventure. Their decision to embrace life in the face of death embodied the unbreakable spirit that sustained many through the plague's darkest days. As the years passed, the Black Death eventually receded into history, becoming the stuff of grim legend. But the memories of its terrible visitation remained raw for generations to come. On the island of Sardinia, villagers still perform a macabre death dance known as the mamuthones. Their blackened faces a ghostly reminder of the bubonic curse that once blanketed the Mediterranean. In the plague's aftermath, Europe slowly recovered, its population rebounding as a new generation replaced those lost to the pestilence. But the Black Death had left an indelible mark on the medieval world, reshaping society in ways that would echo down through the centuries. The rigid feudal order that had dominated Europe for generations crumbled, giving rise to a new middle class. The Catholic Church, once the unquestioned arbiter of spiritual life, found its authority challenged as never before. The Black Death also spurred a renewed interest in classical learning, as scholars turned to ancient texts in search of answers to the plague's mysteries. This revival of classical scholarship, known as the Renaissance, would ultimately give birth to a new era of artistic and intellectual creativity that transformed European culture. But perhaps the plague's most enduring legacy was the stark reminder it offered of life's fragility. In a world where death could strike at any moment, many began to question the rigid certainties of medieval life. The Black Death had shown that even kings and popes were powerless in the face of nature's fury. This realization sparked a new spirit of inquiry and individualism that would ultimately give rise to the modern age. For those who lived through the plague's dark days, the memories of the pestilence would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But in the end, the human spirit proved stronger than even the Black Death. The survivors picked up the pieces of their shattered world and slowly began to rebuild, their resilience a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of unimaginable adversity. Even today, the spectre of the Black Death looms large in our collective imagination, a grim reminder of the ever-present threat of pandemic disease. But the lessons of the plague, the importance of public health, the resilience of the human spirit, and the need for compassion and solidarity in the face of crisis remain as relevant now as they were 7 centuries ago. As we reflect on the Black Death's horrific toll, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the preciousness of every moment. In a world where darkness can descend at any instant, we must cherish the light and love that sustain us, even in the face of unimaginable loss. For it is in these fleeting moments of connection and compassion that we find the strength to endure, to rise from the ashes of tragedy, and to build a brighter tomorrow. So let us remember the Black Death not only as a tale of unimaginable loss, but as a testament to the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. Let us honor the memory of those who perished by striving to create a world of greater kindness, empathy, and understanding. And let us face the challenges of our own time with the same courage and determination that sustained our ancestors through the darkest days of the plague. For in the end, it is not the darkness that defines us, but the light we kindle in spite of it. It is in this eternal dance of shadow and illumination that the human spirit endures, ever resilient, ever hopeful, a flickering flame that no pestilence can extinguish. And it is in this enduring light that we find the promise of a better tomorrow, even amidst the darkest of nights. Sure, I'd be happy to continue the script for what medieval times were like during the Black Plague. Boring history for sleep. Here's the final part of the narration. As winter melted into spring in the year of our Lord 1353, the people of Europe began to emerge from the long, dark night of the Black Death's reign of terror. In many regions, the plague had burned itself out after consuming all available victims. Those who remained, through luck or isolation, or perhaps some natural immunity, looked around at a world utterly transformed. In some areas, entire villages lay abandoned, the only sign of a life the weeds growing up through the dusty streets. Many great cities had lost half their population or more. The survivors wandered through once bustling neighborhoods, the silence broken only by the cries of orphaned children and the wails of grieving widows. But amid the devastation, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. In the Italian city of Siena, the civic-minded Franciscan friar Barnaba da Siena organized relief efforts for the poor and advocated for public health measures to prevent future outbreaks. In England, the newly crowned King Edward III issued a proclamation urging his subjects to resume their normal lives and return to work, promising to protect them from lawlessness and disorder. Indeed, as the shock of the plague began to wear off, Europeans slowly began picking up the pieces and rebuilding their shattered world. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants reopened their shops, and the wheels of commerce and industry began to turn once more. The road to recovery would be long and hard, but the human spirit had proven unbreakable. In the plague's aftermath, medieval society itself would undergo a transformation. The massive loss of life had created a labor shortage, giving peasants more bargaining power and weakening the rigid feudal hierarchy. Many serfs abandoned the manors of their lords in search of better opportunities in the cities, which began to grow and thrive as never before. The old social order was crumbling, and a new, more fluid society was struggling to be born. At the same time, the trauma of the Black Death left a deep and lasting mark on the medieval psyche. The spectre of death had never loomed so large, and the art, literature, and religious beliefs of the late Middle Ages would be suffused with a sense of life's fleeting impermanence. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting the Grim Reaper leading people from all walks of life in a grim promenade to the grave. But there was a positive side to this morbid preoccupation. Confronted with the fragility of life, people became more aware of the importance of living each day to the fullest. The Italian poet Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague's horrors firsthand, wrote in his masterpiece The Decameron, "It was not death, but the fear of death that had been the greatest torment." As Europe emerged from the shadow of the Black Death, it was a changed world, socially, economically, artistically, and spiritually. The old medieval order was gone forever, and the seeds of the Renaissance and the modern age had been planted in the fertile soil of tragedy. The great Italian poet Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague, perhaps put it best: "O happy posterity, who will not experience such abysmal woe, and will look upon our testimony as a fable." Though the plague would flare up sporadically for centuries to come, it would never again bring humanity to the brink as it did in those terrible years of the 14th century. The Black Death had tested the human spirit as never before, and in the end, the human spirit endured. The medieval world was gone, but a new world beckoned on the horizon. And so, we come to the end of our journey through one of the most harrowing chapters in human history. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story of human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and renewal are always waiting on the other side. Thank you for joining me on this excursion into the distant past. I hope you found it both informative and restful. If you've enjoyed our time together, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be here waiting with more soothing stories to lull you into a peaceful slumber. Until next time, sweet dreams.